Thank you very much. Some really interesting talks there. So thank you to Tom, Richard, Jonathan, and indeed Paul there. Really interesting to see different angles there. So in terms of the Reds 10 presentation, the proof of concept at quite a big scale application there, giving confidence to the market, and in terms of seismic and Richard, what Richard was talking about, scaling this across the industry, and very interesting comments about the sort of legal implications there. So, without further ado, I'll get into some questions for the speakers here, and I'll start off with a question that I'd like everybody's views on, but possibly start with Jonathan on. What is the view of government plans to standardise MMC?
Well, I think their plans to standardise MMC is certainly going to help, remove barriers to innovation. The sector-wide standard, I think, is ambitious, but would encourage the wider use of MMC equipment and techniques. And we're aware of the consortium, the Standardisation Research Kit of Parts project that's underway. It's run by the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities, and the aim is to engage the industry to examine ways to make MMC essentially more accessible to the industry, with the objective of reducing limitations. So these might be supplier specific or housing development specific in the case of housing, and the consortium's looking at consortiums to solutions to essentially open up the supply chain to more players, to create more options for house builders. I think this will help protect companies involved in MMC, help to expand the sector, speed up research into MMC's potential, which in our view are obviously all very positive developments.
Well, that's great. Other thoughts? Shall I go to Richard next?
I think I like the intention. Obviously, it's what I've been trying to do for quite some time now. With some success doing it. I think it's what it needs to do to help productivity to be done, but I don't think the scale of it should be underestimated. And I've got to agree what needs to be standardised, what can be flexible, and perhaps more importantly is define what MMC is. Surely it should be construction.
Yeah, should become business as usual for us. And Tom, what's your reflection on the government's plans to standardise?
Yeah, no, I quite like Richard's point about MMC is still kind of in its infancy. So trying to standardise everything too much when you haven't had that kind of natural growth of what that's going to look like is something I wouldn't encourage necessarily. But there is an awful lot of work to be done for MMC to grow into before we start maybe looking at standardising across the entire board. But certainly, I think it's good to standardise certain elements of the MMC side. And there's also lots of different types of MMC. So again, how you define what MMC is would also be good to get more clarity on.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot of progress on that. I think that the work the CAST has done has helped with that a lot. I would say that the business models and business arrangements, and Jonathan touched on a few of those, are very relevant to the wider adoption of these things. And it does take a change of mindset and a change of practices within the industry. Questions come in here. What are the differences between embodied carbon and in-use carbon, and how have these been reduced on the NetCap project? I know Tom, you and Paul talked about this a little bit, but might be worth just saying a little bit more about these distinctions.
Yeah, sure. So at a base level, the key difference between embodied carbon and in-use carbon. Embodied carbon is how much carbon has gone into that building, how much carbon has gone into the construction of that building. And the in-use carbon is how much carbon is that building then going to be using annually throughout its entire life cycle. So they're the two clear distinctions between the two. And in terms of how you can reduce the embodied carbon, can be done through improving your manufacturing process, so reducing your overall wastage, looking at the materials that you are using to construct, how you operate your facility and how efficiently you're operating your facility. So reducing the time in there, using sort of green energy as an example, trying to source and procure your materials locally, trying to use UK manufacturers and suppliers plays a huge role in that. The associated carbon from ordering sort of electronic parts from China compared to a local supplier is enormous. So that's kind of the embodied carbon side. In terms of the in-use carbon, using the sort of smart intelligent buildings technology that's gone into the NetCap scheme. So understanding how users are actually using these buildings rather than how the designers perceived them to use those buildings is really, really powerful, because we can take all of that information, understand how that building is being used, and then tweak the BMS system to work in line with the users rather than against them. On top of this, you can also then share that information with the users and improve their self-awareness. And that's then how you can start looking at driving behavioral change and reducing how much energy is used in the operation of buildings through the users.
Yeah, that's great. I think addressing the performance gap with buildings is something that's risen up the agenda, and we've been used to hearing over the years that there's been a big performance gap. I think the work that you're doing and the data that you're collecting is really helping on that journey and narrowing that performance gap. I was really interested by your statistic around the use of showers, or showers accounting for 85% of the energy used. There's a massive trend for cold water bathing, Wim Hof method and all that. So perhaps the soldiers need to be encouraged to
be taken up. Yeah.
Well-being.
So there's user behavior. You could categorize that under. So it'd be interesting to see whether that could be taken up, and might have quite a significant effect. Quite honestly, joking aside, on the carbon emissions from buildings.
Sam, just
anyway,
to note on that, on the question you just asked as well, we've got a short insight in our booth that talks to MMC and sustainability and sort of briefly covers the operational and embodied carbon elements. So that might be useful for reference.
Oh, that's useful. So do visit that in the breaks if that's
cool.
the way of doing it. A question primarily for Richard, but do comments from anyone. Can the platform approach be applied to any type of building?
Pretty much. It depends on what extent. But yes, there's standardization in most buildings. There's some that you will apply more to than others. If you want a very landmark, very different building, then possibly less so. But most buildings actually tend to be rooms either side of a corridor. And we've been targeting this 80-20 rule of the bulk first, and allow, as products grow, then we'll eventually get there to suit every building. Yes.
And I think I think it's a really important question, this, because economies of scale are so important to this whole concept. And quite frankly, there's a lot of changes to approach needed to address this. People are used to buildings being bespoke, and we're trying to move to an increasingly standardized view of buildings. Bryden Wood, I know, has done a lot of work. Architects have done a lot of work on trying to understand the similarities and the commonalities between different building types. And as part of the program that I ran, Transforming Construction, we looked at the commonalities across the public sector procurement portfolio. And I think we came to the conclusion that about 35% of the construction spend could be categorized as platform designs. I mean, this is obviously bearing in mind that the government spends a lot on transport infrastructure and so forth, which is relatively difficult. So if you were to take transport out of the equation, my experience would be that certainly the majority of construction, more than 50%, could be done using the platform approach. the other challenge, as I've experienced it, is with the sort of open standards for platform solutions for the industry. And Richard, I'm sure you've got some views on this. You touched on it a little bit. The more we can go open with the standards, the better. And it's always a sort of commercial tension with companies that have invested in their own special solutions and wanting to protect that IP, but also fitting in with other products that from other companies. Just could everyone actually give some comments on that issue of open standards and versus sort of proprietary solutions?
We decided to completely change the way we did things to make the platform open to the market. We realised that was the missing piece of the jigsaw to make them happen. It's not financially viable. It isn't for one individual company to develop a platform and then give it away to everybody else, and they're not going to do that. And if you have every construction company, every architectural and design team producing their own, what have you got? You've got traditional construction. So having those common and being able to capture those common standards through a separate organisation and make that out and facilitate it to the existing market is what we thought was the part that was missing.
Yeah, in terms of Tom, you were saying something about what the implication of your question was. What does the seismic platform cover? What's the extent of it? Is that right? Do you want to directly ask Richard about that? Because I think this is interesting. It's a platform. Ultimately, you could have a sort of platform that is an entire building, but we haven't quite got there yet.
So we're talking about a platform, like a foundation platform, that is seismically rated to offer to the earthquake-proof buildings. Is that the? Have I got that right, Richard?
As described in the construction playbook and supported by the product rule book that's been produced by government to show interoperability and exchangeability of businesses, components. What we did when I was developing all the Department for Education schools program was realised that actually volumetric was a really cool way of doing things from a site perspective. But we were having to engage, which is one of the things that Jonathan's picking up on in his part, having to this early engagement. From a client perspective, that's not what you want to be doing. It creates all sorts of problems, and Jonathan listed all the risk items in his speech in terms of that. But I want to also realise that when we overlaid the steel frames that volumetric guys were doing at the time, they were all pretty much the same. 100 mil difference actually across the 5 biggest volumetric manufacturers at the time, 100 mil. And there's lots of stories about that. And as much as many different organisations are doing some wonderful things and whatnot, we're all doing pretty much the same thing, using the same materials, etc., etc. So by having a commonality of components across industry, it really does open things up differently, and that takes away that knows what. So architects and design teams know what to design to, what grid to design to. Manufacturers can produce things, so it becomes a bit like a kitchen in many ways, but at a big scale. Everybody's kitchen is different, to that same grid, and certain things can be manufactured too.
So we've actually have been doing that sort of in-house at ResTen. We've got something we've been developing. We've been calling it the Red Book, and it's effectively our standard designing principles, standard steel connections. And we've, off the back of that, been then developing standard operating procedures. So anyone working in our factories could come in and begin working on one of our projects using those sort of almost like an IKEA sort of, this is how I'm going to assemble this wall to go together, etc. And it's all based off a standard design that we know we've used on XYZ projects, all of which are completely different, but all the designs and sort of processes that have gone into that.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. To be a platform, the whole industry is going to be working the same. If certain companies are doing something, if certain companies doing it and hanging on to it for their USP, understand that, that's a system. What makes it a platform is everybody using it together so that we can benefit and we're not all doing the same thing differently.
And Sam,
That makes
just
it-
very quickly for me, Sam, and just picking up on Richard's point, I think interoperability, IP, interface risk, they're the key points here to help mitigate, and this open approach would do so, especially where we're seeing contracts as well where employers are actually, and funders, institutional funders are looking for to enhance provisions such that the main contractor is warranting the safe use of these systems together. So if that is the case, then there clearly needs to be some focus on that.
That's great. I want to get in one more question at least. Project bank accounts, hot topic, contentious topic, certainly from the tier one contractor point of view. What are the views about project bank accounts in the context of what we've been talking about? Richard, you sort of touched on these issues a little bit, and I know from my own experience working for tier one contractors that the cash flow is such an obsession, I would say, with tier one contractors. Project bank accounts kind of go against what tier one contractors seem to be after. So some views, starting with Richard, on project bank accounts.
Well, I think the government have been trying to talk and promote about project bank accounts as long as I've been in the industry, which is quite some time now, without little understanding of how the construction industry, many of the tier one contractors make their money, and I think that's the blocker. Many of the larger tier one contractors make money on cash flow, so that cash flow is critical. So that by doing that, you're sort of cutting off that avenue of cash flow. Could it be used? Well, if it was mandated, possibly. So it might start forcing up the true profit margins rather than separate ways of making money. So could be, but it has to be mandated.
Jonathan, what's your view?
I think that they're useful, particularly in the context of unfortunately the insolvencies that we're seeing in the market, in terms of providing a direct avenue for direct payment. But again, as Richard touched on, creates cash flow issues. Payments may be better under a milestone basis for MMC elements, and a key point is around are the contractors sophisticated enough to manage them adequately? All of them, some are, but it's a real, it's a point to be aware of. Not all are.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much. We're out of time here, so thank you very much for your presentations and your insights in the chat session.